All right, why did I write the book, Soundings in the Christian Mystical Tradition? It is a question I often get. It goes back actually to 1959. I was an engineer at Worcester Polytech. I was graduating that year. And for some reason, I was at a bookshop in downtown Worcester and saw St. John of the Cross's Dark Night of the Soul. Now, why a 21-year-old engineer to be would pick up a book by St. John of the Cross, I have no idea. All right, but I read it. I was just fascinated by it. A couple of years later, I entered the Jesuits, and I became fascinated with the mysticism and spirituality of St. Ignatius of Loyola. When I entered philosophy out in Weston, I picked up a book by Elmer O'Brien, which is an anthology. It's dated now, but I was amazed at the variety and yet sameness of these people, how they speak of their God experience, but especially the transformation that this God consciousness has upon them. And the rest is more or less history. That I did my doctoral studies under Karl Rahner. The reason I picked him out was his interest in the relationship between mysticism and theology. I got my degree in Germany, wrote on St. Ignatius of Loyola. Then when I went to Santa Clara University, there was a group of Carmelite nuns up the road, and I would give them retreats, say Mass for them in the morning, conferences, and they more or less forced me to read the mystics more carefully, more deeply. But I was always interested in the mystics. Had a sabbatical 1 year. Was able to produce a fairly substantive anthology. And that's really the basis for this work. I wanted something a little deeper, less anthology, and yet more or less acceptable to a wider audience than, say, the anthology. There are people in the book that you would not find, I would say, in average books on, say, mysticism, unless they're extremely scholarly works done by McGinn or Kurt Ruh of Germany, now deceased. But one that comes immediately to mind is Bennett of Canfield. And what fascinated me about Bennett of Canfield is for years it was thought that his superiors forced him to add the last chapter or the last section on the crucified Christ. Because his mysticism, it flows out of the abstract mysticism of that period. God is the nothing, forget everything, the undifferentiated unity between the human soul and God. All right. Well, more recent scholarship shows that that last chapter or that last section is in fact part and parcel of the original text. And what Bennett has done is he says if you really penetrate the crucified Christ, you reach God's nothingness, the self-emptying God. And if you really plunge into God's ultimate mystery as the no thing, as the incomprehensible mystery, then you are led to the crucified Christ. And he just fascinated me the way he worked on the all and the nothing, the so-called abstract mysticism, but at the same time, what Christocentric. So he's one. The second one that fascinates me is a 13th century woman by the name of Marguerite Porete. And she was the first, she was the first in recorded history to be burnt at the stake for a mystical heresy. Mm-hmm. And I never really understood her writing. I sort of, I did. I read her many, many years ago, and I just brushed her aside. But McGinn has a fascinating chapter on Marguerite Porete. So I reread her, and the utter simplicity of that person. Again, the all and the nothing. I think I'll read something from Margaret here. So, just two things. Yeah. Now, this is a fairly uneducated woman, from what we know about her. She says, God's farness is greater nearness. So that paradox between God as the all, the nothing, present, absent. All things are one for her, meaning Margaret, without a why. And she is nothing in a one of this sort. She retains nothing more of herself in nothingness, because he is sufficient of himself, that is, because he is and she is not. So how often in the mystical literature the mystic claims that they are nothing. God is everything. There she is stripped of all things because she is without existence, where she was before she was. Thus she has from God what he has. She's picking up on a theme that began in that century of how all things exist in God prior to their existence. All right, so all things exist in God prior to their creation. They're created. And the mystic is trying to get back to that primordial unity in the Godhead before everything was. Nice if he can do it. But the part I like, it's where I end the book, if I can be a little, how could I put it, proud of some of the writing. But this is the last paragraph. Love had taught Marguerite that the annihilated soul, and I'm quoting, is scorched through mortification, burned through the ardor of the fire of charity, and her ashes are thrown at the open sea through the nothingness of will. All right. The cruel annihilation and incineration of her bodily life at the stake in Paris mirrored the mystical annihilation she had lived. The woman who had said that she lived not by the life of grace or by the life of spirit only, but by the divine life, unencumbered but not gloriously, for she is not glorified. Now she lives divinely, for God has sanctified her of himself. And we can say now that she does live the glorious life. So she's a fascinating one. Let's see. Well, Teilhard is always, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the Jesuit, French Academy of Science, paleontologist, mystic, world traveler. Just fascinated by his Christo-cosmic mysticism. It's a mysticism that sees all of evolution evolving into the cosmic Christ. So he's fascinating. Also the way he combines in himself, he says he was trying to reconcile in himself the world of science, or the physical sciences. And being a paleontologist, he liked rock and earth and so on. And religion, especially mysticism. Another one that comes to mind, although much work is being done on her now, is Mother Teresa. That she was known, all right, she won the Nobel Prize, as you know. The UN, I forget his name now, but that's all right. He called her the most powerful woman in the world. Well, Mother Teresa is known for her apostolic work, her charity, working with the poor, the outcasts, especially in India. Her letters were published about 4 years ago, and she never wanted them to be published. Well, her spiritual director and her bishop and so on. So when the after she died, the movement towards canonization, beatification, these letters were published. And what you find in Mother Teresa is an incredible mystic. And I'll just quote from one of her letters. Absolutely amazing. And just the way I think why she appeals to so many people. Mother Teresa says here, if I ever become a saint, I will surely be one of darkness. I will continually be absent from heaven to light the light of those in darkness on earth. Now you read her letters, and for about 40 years, she lived in utter darkness and dryness. And the way that she found Christ and light was in and through her encounters with the poor and the sick and the dying. Absolutely amazing. At the end of her life, that's why I ended the book this way. But at the end of her life, I mean, how many people could say this? There was one of her sisters who was going by her room. And it was just a couple of days before she died. And she's praying before the crucifix. And she looks at the crucifix and she says aloud, Jesus, I have never denied you anything. You are hard. I like that. And of course, one of my favorites would be St. Ignatius of Loyola, the soldier. In his pre-conversion days, he was given to violence, dueling, gambling, women. Was hit by a cannonball in the leg, the Battle of Pamplona. The French took him back to the family home where he recuperated. And he would daydream about the trashy literature of the day that he had read. As you can imagine, he had all that time on his hands. And the only books available was were the Lives of the Saints and the Life of Christ. And he noticed that after he was finished ruminating on the lives of the saints and the life of Christ, he felt uplifted, and this stayed with him. After he was finished ruminating on the trashy literature, he was dry and empty. And it dawned on him the difference between God's Spirit and the evil spirit. God's Spirit leaves peace and quiet, and the evil spirit leaves dryness and emptiness. You read his diary, and he is perhaps the most overtly Trinitarian mystic in history. Absolutely incredible. His experiences with the Father, the Son, the Spirit, his mystical tasting of the sacred humanity of Christ, his mystical tasting of the motherhood of Mary, and yet, coupled with that, of course, is that extraordinary apostolate that he led. Thousands of letters that he wrote, and the setting up of schools and universities. There's a good friend of mine. She's at Little Sister of the Poor, and she was amazed at how much time Ignatius spent in hospitals. You can imagine what the hospitals were in that day and age. And so you see in that person a profound mystic. And by mystic, I mean someone who has a penetrating God consciousness, a God consciousness that transforms that person. So he's having all these mystical experiences, this mystical life. I prefer the term mystical life to mystical experiences. He's having all these mystical experiences, and it's coupled with apostolic action. And you know that Jesuit spirituality should be contemplation in action, finding God in all things, not only at the kneeler or informal prayer, but in all things. So he's another. I mean, there are many. I think I have over 70 in the book, and I could go on and on and on. We like to talk about what we love. That's what the mystics are. They're in love. I'd say what brings all the mystics together, and brings all the mystics together. I'm going from the Old Testament right down to Mother Teresa. So I've got more than 2,000 years of mystical life here. But one thing that stands out, that radical, total God consciousness that they experience, the way that God consciousness illuminates them to the true nature of the world. And there I think about Plato's cave. They're let out of the cave. They're given this sacramental consciousness. They would claim that they see creation the way God sees creation. So that love of earth, that love of flesh, that love of, the incarnational dimension of, say, Christianity, that runs through it. Then that great desire that they have to sacrifice everything for, for God. There's something else. Oh, yes, the purifying aspect of this experience. That I use the cloud of unknowing as an example. He said when the tiny flame of love begins to take hold of a person, so they fall in love. All right. In the beginning, it's ravishing, it's sweet, but after a while, it turns on the person, and he uses he says, all the sins of a person's past life arise, and they torture the person. So it is not uncommon in the mystical literature to find scrupulosity in the sense of they feel that their sins can never be forgiven. All right. They pass beyond this, and they experience themselves as a lump of sin. So it's probably the pre-conscious life, the unconscious life that has to be purified. Then they experience their own radical nothingness. And that's a common theme, that vis-a-vis God, they experience self, in fact the whole world, and that's a paradox, as a nothing, a redeemed nothing, loved, and because of that something, but on the other hand nothing. And after a while, what begins to take hold of them is they can never love as much as they are loved, and that becomes a torture for them. Augustine, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. Gregory of Nyssa, he picks up on a theme, I believe it's in Philippian, epiktasis, which means that continual straining for God. So that this life, the experience, the quest, it continues even in the afterlife. That even in the afterlife, according to some of these, God cannot be comprehended. Even in the afterlife, there will be this satisfied dissatisfaction. And that's a common theme. Then the paradoxes, and what the language is. Sometimes it's dizzying. You have the all, the nothing, presence, absence, love, hatred. Oh, here's one. One of my favorites is Hadovik, a woman mystic about whom we know very little. She was a beguine. Come on, Hadovik, okay. Yeah, this is opposite here. It's very strange. I mean, I find it very strange. You also find this in Porret to some extent. You find it in Eckhart. But she says here, notice, hell is the seventh name of this love wherein I suffer. So she's talking about a love that is bridal. Many of the mystics use the bridal image from the Song of Songs, language of union. But she goes further. Hell is the seventh name of this love wherein I suffer, for there is nothing love does not engulf and damn, and no one who falls into her and whom she seizes comes out again, because no grace exists there. One of the things you will find in mysticism, one of the aspects of mysticism is, and I say this because many students, many people will read the mystics or take my courses on mysticism, become interested in mysticism, because they think it offers salvation or the quick fix to life, happiness, pleasure, and so on. You read them, and there's a price. A person has to die to self. And for Hadovik, for Porret, and there are others, the high point is this falling into a nothingness that is hell. And they endure that in the way that, well, it's opposite during this Holy Week. The self-emptying of Christ on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? They drink deeply of that life. And again, the paradox. You have resurrection, but you also have death. You go back to Suda Dionysius, who uses the analogy of the Hellenistic theology, that the one is dazzling darkness. Now you look at the noonday sun, the owl looking at the noonday sun. Well, is the sun bright or is it dark? And for some they would emphasize the darkness, and others would emphasize the light. And that's a paradox that runs through many of these mystics. Well, those who read the book, I'm hoping will come away with the conviction that what the mystics speak about explicitly and in intense form, they live in some way. I would go so far as to say that the agnosticism of our age, even the atheism of our age, you can find analogs for that in the mystical tradition. So first and foremost, I would say that the God experience, that the mystics explicate a life that all of us lead in some way. Some repress it, some deny it, and so on, but it's there. All right. That immense longing. And secondly, there's a great emphasis today, interest, in Eastern mysticisms, New Age spirituality, exotic forms of altered states of consciousness, and so on. And not to be defensive, but to be just a bit polemic, there is very little in the Eastern tradition that you won't find in the Christian mystical tradition. It's as deep, it's as profound. Maybe the lotus position you're not going to find. Well, you're not going to find the lotus position in Christian mysticism, but that plumbing of the human depths, the abyss that is the human, and the abyss that Eckhart says the eye by which I see God and the eye by which God sees me are one and the same. That's in the Christian mystical tradition. Then thirdly, you might say that there is a dimension of Christianity that is mystical. It's there. It's not only, say, going to Mass or hearing sermons or, say, vocal prayer, but there's an incredible mystical tradition that runs through Christianity. And it's as deep, as I said, as anything you find in Buddhism or Hinduism. So sure, we can learn from the East. I'm not saying that we shouldn't, but I wish people knew their tradition first, or that Christians knew their tradition first. You know.